Thank you, Meghna. Morning, everyone. We have a very interesting conversation coming up. Dr. Krishnamurthy is joining us. Dr. Krishnamurthy, thank you so much for joining us, and a very good morning to you. This topic is actually very close to our heart because at Times Network, we keep trying to create content which delves into future and we do crystal ball gazing about what is India's growth trajectory. I believe you have a surprise in store for us. There is a new book that you are coming up with, and it is titled very aptly India at 100, Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse. So first of all, congratulations for that. If you can just give us a sort of a preview about one, why you believe India will be economic powerhouse, and second, what is your vision about India at 100?
Thank you very much, Mihir. A very good morning to you and to all our viewers. Thanks for providing me the opportunity to talk about this book, India at 100. It should be forthcoming in a couple of months. So the basic idea is that with the kind of growth that India has registered now in the last 10 years, if we can redouble the good policies that we've implemented over the last 10 years and accelerate the reforms, then India can grow at 8% from here on till 2047. And if India grows at 8%, India can be a $55 trillion economy. Now, that will sound quite audacious, especially if you take into account the fact that EY predicts India to be a $26 economy by 2047. So that's about, less than half. So viewers would wonder, where are the differences? So let me explain for our viewers. So if we assume 7% growth in real terms, 5% inflation, which is what has been there ever since the inflation targeting framework has been implemented, and 3% depreciation of the rupee, that translates into 9% growth in dollar terms, 7 plus 5 minus 3. Why minus 3? Because depreciation of the rupee actually subtracts from growth in dollar terms. So at 9%, using the rule of 70, which is typically what we all use for calculating the number of years it takes to double our money, at 9%, 9 times 8 is 72. So approximately in 8 years, the GDP will double. Now, if we start from 2023 onwards, that's 24 years. In 24 years, doubling every 8 years means 3 times doubling. That's 8 times, essentially, the GDP multiplying. So if we take the GDP number for, 2023, approximately 3.25 trillion, and I'm using approximate numbers so that our viewers can see the ballpark numbers. So, 8 times multiplication will mean from 3.25 to 6.5, from 6.5 to 13, and from 13 to 26. So you can see how the 26 trillion, GDP prediction by EY rests on what I believe is, an important but incorrect assumption of depreciation at 3%, which is what has historically been the case. But in my assessment, there are 2 key trends that are, on in the economy, which we need to recognize, which will lead to much lower depreciation. One, as I mentioned, the inflation targeting framework has been implemented, as a result of which inflation has to be between 2 to 6%, with 4% as the median. Historically, if you look at, in the last few years, inflation has been 5%. So now when you look at the inflation that prevailed from 1990 onwards, or even, earlier period, inflation in India has been 7% plus historically. That's the average. So, going forward, we can actually say, therefore, inflation will be at least 2% lower compared to what has been historically the case. And we know economists, understand this very well, that when inflation is higher, then the depreciation of the currency is also higher. So compared to the 3% inflation, it's likely that inflation going forward will be lower. Compared to the 3% depreciation, it will be about 1%. Now let's do the numbers again, actually. If we take 8% growth, which I said is possible, 5% inflation, 8 plus 5 is 13, subtract 1% depreciation, which is what is likely to prevail because of the lower inflation, then that means 12% growth. Now again, using the rule of 70, 12% is actually doubling every 6 years. 12 times 6 is 72. So in a 24-year period, that means 4 doublings. That's 16 times, as much. So as you can see, from 26, add 1 more doubling, that becomes 52 trillion. So as you can see, with 8% growth and with 5% inflation and 1% depreciation because of the lower inflation. One more aspect which I would want to touch upon, if you look at the Penn World tables, which look at the drivers of growth, the productivity growth in India from 2014 onwards has been 2.7%. In contrast, productivity growth from 2002 to 2013 was 1.3%. In other words, productivity growth has been more than double, and this is not, any government data. Some critics might actually, argue this is Penn World tables, which means productivity has increased, which will also lead to real appreciation of the currency. So I do believe that 3% depreciation, which has prevailed, will not be the case. It will be 1%, and thereby, we can look at a $55 trillion economy if we can grow at 8%.
Right. That's very interesting because actually most of the estimates are in the range of $25 to $30 trillion. And you did give a very good reasoning for that. But Dr. Subramanian, what will it take to sustain this kind of growth momentum? Because, even today, and yesterday I was in conversation with Mr. Arvind Pangadia, and he also made a very important point that today we are not on a very small base. It's, $3.6 trillion economy, and to continue to grow at more than 7 or 8% for a very long time takes a lot of efforts by all quarters. So what will it take to sustain that growth momentum for us to hit that number?
I think that's a very good question. If you look at historically, India has grown from 1990 onwards, average growth has been 7%, slightly more than 7%. So clearly 8% is ambitious because India has not grown consistently at 8% before, but it is achievable. Now it is achievable, through good policies. If we look at, where this growth will manifest, and here we have to account for the fact that there are 3 primary sources through which the 8% growth can manifest. One is the reforms that that can be done, leading to the formalization of the economy. We know very well that formal sector firms are far more productive than informal sector firms. So formalization in the economy will lead to higher productivity. Second, even if we take our formal sector firms, they themselves are actually not at the cutting edge when compared to some of the global firms. So even our formal sector firms also will grow their productivity as we do more reforms. So these are 2 key sources, and we know very well when the formal sector itself actually informal sector starts becoming formal, that also leads to higher GDP because what is not counted in GDP will also add up. So, unlike some of the other economies that we use to benchmark, that advanced economies where the economies were primarily formal and therefore all the productivity growth had to come, from what we economists call the intrinsic margin. In other words, formal sector firms growing their productivity. In the Indian case, the growth can come from both the intrinsic and the extrinsic margin. The extrinsic margin is basically formalization of a large part of the economy as well. Now, I think it is important to recognize, as I said at the outset, 8% is ambitious but achievable. India has grown at 7%. We can grow at 8%, but for that, I think continuation of the good policies that we've had over the last decade is important. We cannot afford a lost decade like we had from 2004 to 2014. And we also need to double down on reforms. And I think Dr. Panagaria might have mentioned, for instance, the labor reforms. The bill has been passed. I think it would behoove the new government when it comes in to pass subordinate legislation so that labor can, the labor laws are made more amenable for manufacturing growth and overall growth itself.
Right. Mr. Krishnamurthy, I also want to understand, when you speak about reforms, one is obviously labor reforms, and definitely I think the next government or the next administration will have to focus on it. We did see a bit of a slowdown in reforms, especially in the agriculture sector. We saw what happened to farm laws. There are reforms which are still expected and required in land acquisition, because that is, I think, going to form the launch pad for the next wave of growth, which we refer to as India's Amrit Kal. So what is your recommendation for that?
So in the book, I cover a wide swath of areas where reforms are required. If we look at, the need for manufacturing sector to be encouraged so that job creation happens, that means we basically need, reforms in land, labor, capital, logistics. I think there's been a lot of good work already that's been done through the infrastructure creation, power sector, and scale as well, because economies of scale reduce the cost for firms. So these are actually reforms that are required in the manufacturing sector. But at the same time, we also need reforms, in our banking, and, especially the banking sector needs to provide credit for manufacturing, for overall the firms to, to be able to grow by taking on credit and by investing. We also need, importantly, reforms in the judiciary and in the bureaucracy as well. Apart from that, of course, agriculture, education, healthcare, these are very important. On agriculture, what I would mention is that, the reforms are required so that the small farmer can really be, empowered. If you look at over the last 10 years, the, concept of Labharthi, the Honorable Prime Minister has introduced that, and thereby actually has shown that good economics can be good politics as well, by making those that have hitherto not benefited from reforms as the Labharthi of reforms. In my opinion, in agriculture, it is really critical that the small farmer is made the Labharthi of reforms. And I'll explain this using an anecdote. Many of us, when we were young, I think we would have traveled in, third-class compartments in railway trains. Now, if you take, for instance, let's say, take the Kalka mail, from, let's say, Delhi. But in Delhi itself, the third-class compartment gets filled up. By the time, one would want to board the third-class compartment in Kanpur, maybe Allahabad or Mughal Sarai, nobody can get in, right? And that's the way in which, if you look at, reforms, I think those that are benefiting from status quo are the ones that are, often blocking reforms. And this is where it is important to actually, for the narrative to be created where, there are others, who want to actually get into the third-class compartment so that they can reach their destination as well. And in the case of agriculture, it is a small farmer. So the small farmer needs to be made as the real Labharthi, because current, status quo does not benefit the small farmer at all.
Right. I want to touch upon one more very important aspect, which is the digital infrastructure. And, India has been praised for the excellent work and progress that has happened in creating the digital ecosystem, the digital infrastructure. Now, obviously, there are talks about, AI and its impact. But I want to touch upon this digital infrastructure part, because that is going to play a role of a major catalyst in propelling India to whatever its target is.
Yes, when from the vantage point that I am able to occupy now in the board of the International Monetary Fund, this is one area where, my heart swells with pride whenever, digital infrastructure is talked about, because the kind of digital infrastructure that India has created today is now, is basically, as they say, owner's pride, neighbor's envy. This is really critical because India has created this digital infrastructure as a public good. Whenever it is created actually by private parties, digital infrastructure or any infrastructure, that often leads to monopolies and thereby monopoly pricing, which can then lead to, large sections of the population not getting access to the, to the infrastructure. In contrast, by creating, the public digital infrastructure, take for instance the Jan Dhan, accounts, 500 million plus accounts, and, in the board, for instance, I mentioned this is 1.5 times the US population. So that's how much we've actually created. So we've provided access to everybody, on the public digital infrastructure. So that can lead to inclusive growth. So let me give you a small anecdote to actually show not only is it, will it lead to inclusivity, but also will lead to productivity improvement. So the anecdote that I want to share is, when I used to be working at the Indian School of Business before I came to the North Block, I used to actually step out of the ISB campus and go to, drink coffee or tea from a small vendor. We would pay him cash at that time. This is, I'm talking about before, 2018. Once I came back after, for a short period when I was again, at ISB, I happened to go and visit that person again. Now, he was actually taking digital payments. So earlier what used to happen is that he would take maybe a couple of minutes to make coffee or tea, but he would also have to spend equal amount of time ferreting out change. If I gave him a 50 rupee note or a 100 rupee note, he would have to actually pick out 43 or 93 rupees because the coffee costed 7 rupees. That costed him as much time as to make coffee. Now what happens is actually he only makes coffee and we just pull out our phones and pay, so his productivity has increased. Not only that, and I was actually talking to him because I speak in Telugu, so the native language. He was telling me that earlier the supplier of milk who used to come, now remember these are basically cash and carry kind of models every day, so the milk supplier would come and deliver the milk in the morning and would come in the evening to come and collect cash again. This was when the cash was the mode of payment. Now what happens is because this vendor itself gets paid using, digital payments, he just makes the digital payment to the milk supplier as well. So productivity down the supply chain for the milk supplier has also increased, and this kind of, improvement can happen across the supply chain. Last example, if you take, for instance, you go to Sarojini Nagar, in Delhi, those people who are actually vending on the streets, even they take digital payments. Now, I suppose one of these vendors goes to a bank and says, Saab, main 50,000 rupees kamata hu. I earn 50,000 rupees. Earlier with cash payment, the bank officer would have said, I don't believe you. But now he can actually pull out his phone and say, Saab, dekhiye, mera actually, main 50,000 kamata hu, actually, mera record dekh lijiye. So he can say, look at my record, actually, I indeed earn 50,000 rupees. And using that, the bank can indeed actually give him a loan. So these are all the kind of opportunities, unprecedented opportunities that today India has, which India must tap into for 8% growth and thereby a $55 trillion economy by 2047.
Absolutely. Sir, I also want to understand, because there is a lot of thrust on the manufacturing, and we all talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, and in fact, there is a lot of focus on strategic sectors as well, like, for example, semiconductors or making India self-reliant in space of defense. In fact, immediately after this, we'll be joined by Honorable Defense Minister Sri Rajnath Singh, who is going to talk about it. But I want to understand, in your opinion, in your view, between now and 2047, which are the sectors which will predominantly drive India's growth within manufacturing? I'm just focusing on manufacturing right now. Within that, and to do that, what are the steps or reforms that we need to take?
So, on this we had actually written about it in the 2019-20 economic survey. If you look at China, the way China grew, it utilized its demographic dividend. In the next 25 years, India also actually has this opportunity to utilize its demographic dividend. So India needs to actually not only do value-added, manufacturing, which of course will happen later, but also do, manufacturing like assembling. Many critics, for instance, will say, oh, we should be only doing value-added stuff. But I've actually firmly believed that you cannot, start running without having learned to walk. And in the case of manufacturing, first assembling is the walking, and higher value-added stuff is the, is the running. Let's take a few examples. Let's take, the automobile sector in India. In the 1980s, when Maruti was created, started operations, we were importing almost entire, and just the assembling of the car was, Maruti car was being done in India. But over time, you see the ancillary sector, the entire, supply chain developed as well. And the same thing is now happening with electronics as well. So it is really critical in order to provide good jobs for our youth, to utilize the demographic dividend, that we do not just, focus on the higher value added stuff. I think we should be doing both. We should be actually letting the organic growth happen, which is start, assembling, in many of these areas. Electronics, it's happening. And then naturally the supply chain will expand. So I think we should not be too, stubborn, saying that, oh, we should be only doing the high value added stuff. That is important, but at the same time, assembling is also critical. Now, when you asked me about the reforms, I touched upon it, in answering an earlier question of yours. which is, I think if you look at the cost of manufacturing, that is driven by factors, which is land, labor, capital, logistics, power, and scale. And I think each one of these, the reason actually our manufacturing has not developed well is not because of our entrepreneurs, it is because of, policy failures. After 1991, while we liberalized the product markets, we never liberalized these factor markets. Only recently, in the last 10 years, through the Make in India has, efforts have been done. But there's more work that needs to be done. So I will actually say if these policies are, policy failures are addressed on land, on labor, on capital, logistics, I think a good amount of work has already been done. For instance, if you see the time on ports, for instance, it has reduced. Travel time is also reduced. Power sector, I think this is also, one that requires reforms. And scale. Many of our legislations actually perversely encourage firms to remain dwarfs. And when firms are very small, they cannot reap economies of scale, thereby reduce their average costs. So I think each one of these 6 categories of, of basically factors that go into manufacturing, if we do the reforms, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind why manufacturing cannot pick up. Again, I will say manufacturing sector in India has not picked up because of policy failures. And if we address these policy failures, I think, growth will happen. As it is already happening, we are seeing some, good traction. If you look at the recent data, manufacturing sector growth has been good, which actually suggests that this works. It's not rocket science. If we take care of these 6 factors, I think manufacturing growth will definitely happen.
Right. One last question to you, Dr. Krishnamurthy. Our theme for today's summit is India Unstoppable. And obviously, in a lot of ways, the world believes that India is unstoppable. You also hold a position at International Monetary Fund, and even their commentary has been highly optimistic about India. So, in your own words, what makes India unstoppable at this moment?
I also want to respond quickly to actually the second part of your previous question. I forgot to, on defense, I'll just shortly mention, I think the Honorable Minister will, of course, talk more about it. But I think in defense, overall defense, manufacturing is very critical because across the world, if you look at a lot of the innovations that have happened, and especially if you look, post the Second World War, most of the innovations that started in defense actually then went on, to the commercial sector. So I think the opening up of defense manufacturing, which was done, is really critical. This will be a key sector as India moves ahead. Now, as for, India being unstoppable, I think, as I said, I am very optimistic, but at the same time cautiously optimistic. I always say this, which is, we certainly can grow at 8%, but we cannot take it for granted. 8% growth will happen if we can redouble the reforms that we've done, the good policies that we've implemented over the last 10 years, good economic policies. We cannot afford, and I repeat again, we cannot afford the kind of lost decade. If you recall, and you just use the numbers, when China was growing at 12% plus in the first half of, this is before the global financial crisis, we were actually celebrating by growing at 7% odd. And we did not do anything on policy at that time. I think it is really critical that we do not have a repeat of that kind of episode. So reforms actually is really critical, redoubling of policies. If we do that, then I think we can grow at 8%. As I said earlier, we can grow by formalizing the economy, which will increase our productivity. We can also, increase the productivity in our formal sector firms, and just the formalization itself will add GDP as well, because, that's not being counted at this point in time. So, cautiously optimistic. I think, it is important to make sure that we do not take 8% growth for granted. We have to focus on reforms and implementing good policies. In that case, India is unstoppable.
Right. One last question, Dr. Krishnamurthy. We are in a very unique, evolving scenario as far as the global economy is concerned. So we have a complete shape-shifting as far as I would say the globalization is concerned. We have a conflict which is going on in Europe, and it's every day, it threatens to expand from its current limited scope. We have conflict in Middle East, and we have the so-called almost imminent phase 2 of US-China trade war. What would be your concerns or red flags on global growth, considering the current geopolitical environment that we are in?
I think the concerns that you've highlighted are quite germane. If you look at the global growth projections that are being done by the fund, these are at a two-decade lows. So clearly, global growth is getting affected by not only the trend against globalization, but also some of the conflicts that have erupted in different parts of the world. So global growth will be, even going forward, I think we will have to actually take into account the fact that global growth may not be very supportive. If we get tailwinds from global growth, that's great, but we cannot, bank on it. Therefore, India needs to really strengthen its domestic economy, make sure, for instance, if you look at, if you sort of do an accounting classification, about 58% of our GDP comes from our own domestic consumption. And therefore, we do have the potential, if we can create enough jobs, that will lead to much higher consumption. So we need to make sure that our reforms actually strengthen, our domestic economy. And for that, I think social and economic inclusion, inclusive growth is really critical. So, summary, I think global growth in the next 20 odd years may not be very high, and that will be a risk factor. So domestic policy will have to actually, overcome some of this. I think if you see in the last few years, at a time when the global growth has been quite anemic, India has successfully grown at 7% plus, and possibly this year, I expect growth to be closer to 8%. So I think we've demonstrated we can grow at those rates, provided we do good policy. I will repeat that again. We cannot take 8% growth for granted. It is possible, it is optimistic, but actually requires, reforms and redoubling of good economic policy that we've had over the last 10 years.
Absolutely. So my key takeaway is that contrary to popular estimates, India can actually become a $50 trillion plus economy by 2047, provided we don't take our growth for granted, provided we don't take the solid base that we have for granted, continue on the path of reforms, and continue to deliver year on year on our promises. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, and congratulations. We'll be keenly awaiting the release of this book. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.